I grew up in a house that my grandparents had built long before I was born. It was out in the country. If we needed groceries after dinner, my dad would just say we could wait until the next day instead of driving back. I didn't think much about where we lived when I was a kid because it was just normal to me. We had fields behind the house, woods off to one side, and an old cemetery across the narrow road that ran past our driveway. Growing up near a cemetery bothered me? No, it really didn't for most of my childhood. Kids get used to strange things if they're around them long enough. I paid more attention to the cows in the neighboring pasture than I ever did the graves. My mom would remind me not to cut across it if I was riding my bike because she thought it was disrespectful, but besides that, nobody really talked about it. The cemetery was surrounded by old oak trees, and behind it the woods started immediately. Those woods stretched for miles. My dad hunted there during deer season with permission from one of the neighboring landowners, and every once in a while we'd see people walking trails, but it wasn't somewhere people wandered around after dark. There weren't many streetlights out where we lived. I'm positive it was my sophomore year. I was worrying about driver's ed around that time. My room was upstairs on the front side of the house. It had one window facing the road and another angled that I could see the entire cemetery. Most nights I'd stay up later than my parents. They both went to bed around 10 since my dad got up before sunrise for work. Cell phones weren't really something everybody had back then, and the internet wasn't part of my nightly routine yet, so evenings felt slower. You either watched TV, read something, or looked out the window when you got bored. I spent a surprising amount of time looking outside. There wasn't much traffic. Every once in a while, someone from town would drive by, and during harvest season, tractors would still be moving around late. I'd sometimes recognize headlights before I recognized the vehicle, because everyone around there drove the same roads every day. In late fall, if I remember right, I was sitting at my desk trying to finish an assignment that I'd ignored most of the week. I kept getting distracted because it had started raining lightly. You could hear it tapping against the roof and see it reflecting in the road whenever a car passed. I looked toward the cemetery because I thought a car had turned in somewhere, a small red light moving between the headstones. It was not bright. If somebody had been carrying a flashlight, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. This wasn't white, and it wasn't lighting up the ground very much. It looked like a little red lantern. It floated along slowly, stopping every now and then. I was trying to figure out who would even be out there. I knew a few older people in town visited graves regularly. The only thing that didn't make sense was the time. It had to be close to 12. I watched for a few minutes because there wasn't anything else to do. From where I was sitting, I couldn't see whoever was carrying the light. I just saw that red light weaving between the graves. It reached the far end of the cemetery near the woods. The light kept going until it disappeared into the trees. My mom thought someone had been visiting a relative's grave and used one of those camping lanterns with a red cover. I remember one Saturday, we spent half the afternoon cleaning leaves out of the gutters, and my younger sister kept throwing handfuls of wet leaves down on us because she thought it was funny. Little things like that are what I remember most about that period of my life. A few days later, I had gotten up to close the window, and while pulling the curtain across, I saw the same red light, same place. It was weaving between the graves again. It had to be the same person doing whatever they'd been doing before. I watched longer. The light stopped beside one of the larger monuments for what felt like few minutes. Eventually, the light headed toward the woods again. I walked into the hallway and grabbed a pair of binoculars my dad kept in the linen closet because he used them during hunting season. They weren't great for nighttime, but I figured I'd at least see who was carrying the light. By the time I got back, the light was gone. I scanned the cemetery, checked the edge of the woods. Nothing there. I was about to give up when I saw someone near the fence closest to our house. I thought it was one of the fence posts because they were painted black and blended into the darkness. Someone standing there. Even through the binoculars, I couldn't see much because there wasn't enough light. Whoever it was wasn't looking around. They seemed to be facing my window. I lowered the binoculars because I thought I was seeing things. I was calling for my parents without taking my eyes off the window. When nobody answered, I called again. My dad came upstairs. I pointed toward the cemetery and handed him the binoculars. He looked outside. "Where?" he asked. I pointed again. The figure wasn't there. I watched from the upstairs window as he shined the flashlight around the fence line, across the cemetery entrance, and toward the woods. When he came back, he said there wasn't anybody around, and that if someone had been there, they left as soon as they heard us moving through the house. Before I get into the rest of it, I should mention that after my dad looked around outside, life settled back down for a while. It wasn't like every night became terrifying. I stopped mentioning it because nobody else had seen anything. My parents never laughed at me or told me I was making it up. We hadn't gotten much snow yet, but the mornings were cold enough that frost covered the fields every day. My dad left for work before sunrise. My sister was complaining about having to wear a heavier coat to school, and my mom had already started decorating for Christmas. My parents had gone to bed. I stayed up until pretty late. I looked outside a couple of times out of habit. Nothing. I shut everything off and went to bed. I sleep pretty heavily once I fall asleep, but I've always been the kind of person who wakes up if there's a loud enough noise. Something hit my bedroom window hard enough to wake me. One solid impact. Sounded like somebody had thrown a handful of dirt against the glass. I was still half asleep and heard something inside my room. I didn't hear somebody climbing through the window. Didn't hear the window open. I remember lifting my head and seeing a dark shape moving toward my bedroom door. The hallway light downstairs was always left on overnight. Whoever it was wasn't standing in the doorway looking at me. They were already leaving. I don't think they expected me to wake up. I heard running overhead, like what sounded like running through the hallway outside my room. Waking up suddenly leaves you confused. I wondered if my dad had come upstairs for something until I heard the back door downstairs slam so hard. I jumped out of bed and screamed. Mom told both my sister and me to stay upstairs. Of course I didn't stay upstairs. I followed my dad halfway down. The back door was standing open. Air was blowing into the kitchen. After a few minutes, he came back inside. Once everybody calmed down enough to look around my room, we started seeing things. There was dirt everywhere. Clumps of damp dirt scattered across the carpet near the window, along one side of my bed and leading toward the bedroom door. Some of it had fallen onto my desk chair. There were dirty smears on the edge of the dresser where someone steadied themselves while moving through the room. Fresh soil has a really specific smell when it's damp. It reminded me of helping my dad dig fence posts after it rained. My room smelled like that. The window was still locked. He tried lifting it harder, thinking somebody had forced it open and closed it again, but there weren't any broken latches or damage around the frame. The bedroom door had been closed when I went to sleep, but I couldn't remember if I'd locked it. We never locked bedroom doors growing up. Nothing was missing. Whoever had come into my room didn't seem interested in taking stuff. I don't remember ever seeing the red light again after that winter. I can't explain how I woke up to someone already inside my room, why nothing was stolen, or why the room looked like someone had walked through carrying half the ground in with them. My parents talked about it over the years. Whoever that person was somehow ended up standing inside my bedroom. I spent a little over 8 months living out of my SUV after I lost my apartment. It wasn't something I advertised. My family thought I was traveling for work most of the time, and only a couple of close friends knew what was actually going on. The hardest part wasn't sleeping in the vehicle. After a few weeks, I got used to it. I had a small camping mattress in the back, blackout covers for the windows, a power bank, and enough storage bins that everything had its place. Finding somewhere to park every night was what got exhausting. You rotate between truck stops, rest areas, public land, quiet industrial streets, and trailheads, because staying in the same place too often usually attracts attention. Some nights were noisy because of traffic. I liked forest roads more than city parking lots whenever I could find them. I slept better when I wasn't worried about someone knocking on the window at 3 in the morning. As long as I arrived before dark, kept my lights off afterward, and left early, nobody usually bothered me. One evening, I ended up farther from town than I normally would have gone. I had driven around for almost an hour because a couple of places I normally used already had other campers parked there, and another area had fresh, no overnight parking signs that hadn't been there the week before. It just wasn't somewhere most people would randomly drive. About half a mile farther in, there was what looked like an old neighborhood that had never really become one. There were 6 or 7 houses spread out along one side of the road. Calling them houses almost feels generous because they had clearly been abandoned for years. Windows were broken almost everywhere, and weeds had grown over what used to be driveways. They didn't look burned down or destroyed by a storm. They just looked forgotten. There weren't any fences around them, and there wasn't a single vehicle anywhere nearby. I parked farther down the road where the trees opened into a little gravel pull-off. From where I was, I could see the first couple of houses through gaps in the trees if I leaned forward in the driver's seat. It wasn't close enough that I felt like I was parked in someone's yard. Something outside had pulled me awake, like hearing a noise inside a dream until your brain slowly realizes it's real. It was after midnight. I stayed where I was. Once you're living in a vehicle for a while, you get into the habit of not immediately uncovering the windows every time you hear something outside. I lifted one corner of the front windshield cover just enough to look toward the road, someone walking. That by itself wasn't strange enough to worry me. Hunters come through areas like that. Homeless people camp in forests too. He wasn't following the road. He kept wandering onto the abandoned properties, disappearing inside one house for a minute or two, coming back out, crossing the road, then walking into another one. I watched him do it a few times. There wasn't any flashlight. I could make out his movements whenever he stepped into open areas. I figured he might be scavenging scrap metal or looking for things people had left behind years ago. He would disappear into a house and come back empty-handed. After a few minutes, he entered one of the houses closer to where I was parked. From my angle, I couldn't see the doorway, only the front corner of the building. A little while later, he came back outside carrying something large. I thought it was another person. The shape was about the size of an adult, hanging in his arms. Then he lowered it onto the ground near what used to be the front steps. I could tell it wasn't moving. He adjusted it until it was sitting upright. It looked like one of those full-sized store mannequins. I wondered if it was one of those realistic dolls people use as movie props. Whatever it was, it looked disturbingly human. Its head was tilted to one side, arm rested across its lap. The way he positioned it looked deliberate, like he wanted it facing the road. He stood beside it for a few seconds. Then he walked back into the same house. I laughed quietly to myself because I convinced myself there had to be some harmless explanation I wasn't understanding. Maybe I'd interrupted somebody's weird late-night project. I was thinking that if I drove away right then, I'd probably spend the rest of my life wondering what I had seen. So I stayed. A few minutes passed, then voices carried through the trees. 2 people arguing somewhere inside the house. I assumed someone else had been in there the whole time. The conversation got louder for a moment, although I still couldn't understand anything specific. It was just raised voices overlapping each other. I heard one man yell, a strained scream that echoed through the trees in a way that made it impossible to tell exactly where inside the house it came from. It stopped so abruptly. Immediately afterward, I heard footsteps. Someone was running, like across the inside of the building or behind it. Loose boards, debris were being kicked around. The same man I'd been watching walked out the front alone. He wasn't running. He looked calm. The strange part, I could still hear somebody running somewhere around that house. I couldn't actually see anyone except him. He didn't react to the sound. He walked over to the life-size doll, picked it up, balanced it against his shoulder, and started walking toward the woods instead of following the road. The running noise continued for another few seconds after he'd already reached the tree line. From where I was parked, I never saw another person leave that building. Only him. And he disappeared into the forest, carrying something that looked enough like a person that I kept catching myself checking whether it moved. I waited until every sound had stopped before climbing into the driver's seat. I started the engine, turned around as carefully as I could without using my high beams, and drove out of there. There are plenty of places to spend the night when you're living in a vehicle. I just never had any interest in seeing those abandoned houses again. I even spent some time looking at satellite images months later because I couldn't remember exactly where those houses had been. I wasn't trying to investigate anything. I think I just wanted to see if I'd imagined how isolated the place was. Forest roads all start looking alike after a while. I never found the exact spot again. There were a few abandoned properties scattered around that general area, but nothing that made me think, that's it. Living in a vehicle changes the way you notice people. You're already paying attention to anyone who comes near your car because you're basically sleeping behind a locked door that's only a few inches thick. You learn to recognize normal behavior pretty quickly. Dog walkers, campers, hikers, people looking for a place to smoke, teenagers. Most people don't even notice you're there. That guy stood out. I've seen mannequins before. Store displays, Halloween props, those CPR training dummies. This wasn't quite like any of those. It wasn't because I got a detailed look at it. I definitely didn't. It was the proportions. Even from that distance, it looked oddly realistic. The shoulders weren't perfectly straight the way mannequins usually are, and the head seemed to lean naturally instead of sitting stiffly upright. It could have been an expensive movie prop for all I know. I'd remember how carefully he set it down before going back inside the house. I didn't know what I would have reported. I was parked somewhere I probably shouldn't have been myself. I hadn't seen anyone get hurt. Those things sound terrible when you put them together, but separately, they're not exactly enough to explain where I was or why I'd been sitting there watching abandoned houses in the middle of the night. Even now, I don't know if I made the right decision. Maybe it was nothing more than two people arguing over something while another guy happened to be moving a prop around. At least, it's an explanation. The running continued after the man was already outside. I wasn't watching through binoculars. I had a narrow view through the windshield, and there were trees between me and the houses. If another person came out a side door or through the back, I wouldn't have seen them. And the sound. It wasn't faint. It sounded close enough that I expected somebody to come bursting around the front corner of the house. What happened was I watched the same man bend over, lift the doll again, settle its weight against himself, and disappear into the woods without ever looking hurried. I don't remember what he looked like anymore. I couldn't describe his face if someone asked me. I remember dark clothing and an average build, but that's about it. I remember the shape over his shoulder. For a split second, as he adjusted it, one of its arms swung loosely. It might have just been made that way. It might have been attached with loose joints, but it looked so natural that I caught myself holding my breath until he disappeared between the trees. I saved enough money to rent another apartment. The SUV became just a vehicle instead of my bedroom. Most of the habits I picked up during that period disappeared. I stopped planning every evening around where I could park safely. I stopped checking every noise outside before falling asleep. But that memory, I don't know why I heard someone running after the only person I ever saw had already stepped outside. And I don't know why someone would carry something that looked so much like a person from one abandoned house into the woods after midnight. When I replay that night, I end up back at the same image of that man disappearing between the trees, with what looked from where I sat exactly like a person over his shoulder, while another set of footsteps echoed somewhere behind him where nobody ever appeared. Out of everything that happened while I was living in my vehicle, and there were plenty of strange nights, that's the only one I've never been able to file away as just another weird experience. It still feels unfinished, like I drove away in the middle of something I was never supposed to witness. Maybe, if I'd stayed another 5 minutes, I would have figured out what was actually happening. Or maybe leaving immediately was the smartest decision I made that entire year. We lived on a small farm for a few years before my parents eventually moved. I've had plenty of scary moments since then, but this one, it was because Looking back now as an adult, I think there was a dangerous person wandering around our property. The farm wasn't huge. My dad worked another job during the week, and the farm mostly helped cover expenses. We had chickens, a few goats, some sheep depending on the year, and a couple of pigs every so often. My mom kept a big vegetable garden that seemed enormous when I was a kid. The nearest neighbor was a few minutes away by truck. Back then, I thought everybody grew up like that. My friends from school lived farther into town, so coming over to our place always felt like some kind of adventure to them. They liked climbing hay bales, feeding the goats, and riding around in the old utility vehicle my dad had bought used years earlier. To me, it was just normal life. I complained about chores constantly. If my dad asked me to carry feed buckets or collect eggs, I'd drag my feet every single time. Now I'd probably appreciate having that kind of quiet. Most mornings started about the same. Dad left early for work, Mom handled things around the house, and before school, I'd help with something small if there was time. After school, I'd either wander around outside, fish in the creek if my parents knew where I was, or ride my bike around the gravel driveway until dinner. The fencing around the property, it wasn't one continuous fence. Different pastures had their own sections, and beyond the last fence line, there were stretches of woods and overgrown fields that technically belonged to someone else. Nobody spent time back there. Every now and then, hunters had permission during deer season, but the rest of the year it was empty. At least that's what we assumed. One afternoon, I was throwing a tennis ball for our dog. Our dog suddenly stopped chasing the ball. He stood there looking toward the back fence. Way out near the far end of the pasture, a couple 100 yards away, I saw somebody walking slowly along the fence line. I could tell it wasn't one of our neighbors because I recognized all of them. Most people out there drove somewhere instead of walking anyway. I remember asking my mom if somebody was coming over. She shaded her eyes with one hand and said she didn't know. He wasn't walking toward our house. He just kept moving along the fence, stopping every so often like he was looking across the pasture. My mom figured it was someone checking property lines or looking for a lost dog. Those kinds of things happened once in a while. After another minute, she went back to hanging clothes, and I stopped thinking about it too. That's the last ordinary day I remember from that period. A few days later, Dad came inside after feeding the animals, looking frustrated. One of the chickens had been killed overnight. He figured it was a fox. Predators got through fencing or found weak spots. Dad patched whatever he thought needed fixing and said we'd have to be more careful about locking things up. Then another animal turned up dead not long afterward. This time, it bothered him more because it didn't make sense. He kept walking around the fencing trying to figure out where something had gotten through. I remember him talking to another farmer down the road who said stray dogs sometimes traveled in packs and caused damage without eating much afterward. Apparently that happened more often. So everyone had explanations. Nobody talked about the man near the fence. Weeks went by. School started again. Homework became more annoying than chores. Football season started, and my friends mostly talked about games during lunch. The animals stayed locked up every evening. Dad replaced sections of fencing. A month went by. My parents and I had already eaten dinner. I was in my bedroom doing homework because my mom insisted I finish it before watching television. My room faced the backyard, and if I looked out my window I can see part of the animal pens whenever the floodlights were on. I remember hearing one of the goats making noise. My dad heard it too. Another animal started making noise. Dad stood up and said, "They're stirred up again." Mom looked out the kitchen window but couldn't see anything from there. The two of them headed outside together. I stayed in my room because nobody told me to come. I preferred finishing homework quickly so I could watch TV afterward. For a minute I could hear muffled voices, but they were too far away to make out. I got up because I was curious. The window over my desk looked toward the backyard. When I pulled the curtain back, I was looking at someone standing only a few feet away from the glass. It was a man, older than my dad. It's hard to judge someone's age when you're a kid. There was blood across his shirt, both hands, and part of his face, like he'd been wiping his hands on himself. He was staring through the window. He turned fast and ran alongside the house toward the trees behind the shed. I screamed. The next thing I remember is running across the house, yelling for my parents as loudly as I could. They came back because they must not have been very far away by then. Dad went around the house. He hadn't found anyone. What he had found were more dead animals. Somebody had definitely been on the property. The next morning, in daylight, there were footprints near the pens and around the side of the house, but they disappeared once they reached harder ground. My parents called the sheriff. We added better locks. Nobody caught whoever had been there. Every now and then another farmer in the area would mention finding livestock hurt or missing, but that wasn't enough to connect it to one specific person. Predators really did cause damage from time to time, and there was no way to know whether those incidents were related. We moved away about a year later. That man did something. I know he was. My parents believed me because of what they found outside. How quietly he must have crossed the yard to end up outside my bedroom window, while both of my parents were only a short distance away. If I'd never walked over to that window, he would have stayed there longer. He was waiting for everyone to go back inside. Dad told me there were footprints around the livestock pens and along the side of the house, but the ground got harder closer to the driveway, and they couldn't follow them. There wasn't much to go on. The sheriff asked me what the man looked like, and all I could say was that he had blood on him and dirty clothes. I couldn't remember if he had a beard or not. I was paying more attention to the blood than his face. Decades later, that's still the first thing I picture. Nobody said they were scared, but everyone acted differently. Before that, I'd disappear for hours, riding my bike or walking down to the creek, and as long as I was home before dinner, nobody worried too much. But after that night, she always wanted to know exactly where I was going. If I wanted to fish, Dad came with me. If I wanted to play outside, it had to be close enough that the house stayed in sight. I thought she was overreacting. As an adult, I completely understand it. My parents never really forgot. We stayed on that farm for about another year. The move had nothing to do with what happened. Financially, it just made more sense to live closer to town. At the time, I was disappointed because I liked having so much space to explore. That creepy man, why he was outside my bedroom window while my parents were occupied at the animal pens. He wasn't lost. The second he saw me, he ran. First, there was someone standing near the fence watching the farm. Whether it was the same person or not, I can't say. My dad always believed it was the same man. My parents are older now. The truth is, I don't know who that man was, where he came from. Seeing me through the window ruined whatever he planned to do next. I wonder if whoever stood outside my window ever got caught for something somewhere else, or if he disappeared into another rural town where nobody knew his face.